All right. You good? Okay. So let's just dive into this since we're already a little bit short on time. Thanks, Leland. Today I'm going to talk about React Navigation. It's a navigation library for React Native. It also works to some extent on the web. So naturally, perhaps not entirely everybody in this audience is familiar with the term navigation. So when I talk about navigation, essentially I'm talking about how the user moves between screens in an app. So there's usually some state associated with navigation. So this would be like your URL history stack in the browser. There's also some UI associated with navigation. So it might be the buttons that you press on to move between different places in your app, or the labels that you see that indicate where you are within the app. A web browser provides a lot of the a lot of the infrastructure for you for navigation, just kind of out of the box. So, for example, you have the history API built into the browser. You have a back button. You can swipe back and swipe forward. There's an address bar. There's this little bar on the bottom of the screen. This is great. You get all these things just out of the box. And your blank slate when you're starting a website kind of looks like this. The trade-off here, of course, is that there's not too much you can do to actually get rid of this, and you're kind of stuck within this model. So in React Native apps, this is your blank slate, sort of. Actually, you could get rid of the text also. And you might notice there's essentially like nothing there. There's no address bar, there's no buttons, anything. And so anything that you provide for navigating between screens in your app is entirely up to you. Whereas when you go into just like any iOS app, you'll see that there's things like a navigation header, there's maybe a tab bar, you might have buttons, you jump between screens within the app quite easily. And there's a lot of different like common patterns that you would want to have inside of your app. So you know, these common patterns, we just need to use them in our apps. So basically, what are we going to do to take care of this? And there are a lot of navigation libraries out there. I think this is one of the things that most trips people up when they're coming into React Native. But if we kind of ignore the API differences and kind of the sort of superficial level implementation details, essentially what you end up with is two categories of navigation libraries. There's libraries that are written mostly in JavaScript and libraries that are written mostly natively. So there's React Native Navigation, I think, is the most popular version of a library written natively. So React Navigation is implemented mostly in JavaScript. What that essentially means is that we don't depend on any native code that's outside of the React Native core. If we follow that further, what that means is that we use the same primitives that you would use to build your app to build navigation. And so that means you can kind of understand how everything's implemented, you can extend it, you can debug it, all those sorts of things without having to touch any native code. Of course, there are trade-offs associated with this, which probably a bunch of you have actually run into at some point. And if you are just getting into this and you're not familiar with the problem space yet, definitely check out some of the sections in the React Navigation documentation where we talk about the pitch and anti-pitch and some limitations and alternative libraries. All right, so let's actually just talk about React Navigation now. So I mean, it's only been a couple minutes. Probably you're already a little bit tired of hearing the word navigation. So we'll introduce a few new terms. And these terms are really essential to understanding how to use React Navigation and kind of getting a mental model for how it works. So the three most important terms here are navigators, routes, and screen components. So a navigator is a React component that kind of provides the state and the views that implement a particular navigation pattern. So, for example, the tabs that we saw earlier. A navigator has one or more routes. So these are the different screens inside of that particular implementation of the pattern. Each route has to have a screen component, and this is essentially just the component that's rendered when the route is active. And a key thing to remember here is that a screen component can also be another navigator. So if I were to turn that into a visualization, which I did, it would look like this. So you see at the top there's a navigator. It contains routes. Each route has a screen inside of it. Of course, if we were to factor in the last point there, we could see that a screen can also be a navigator, and that navigator can have, of course, routes itself, and this can continue on indefinitely. So let's look at our first kind of navigator. This one is probably the most basic one in React navigation. It's called a switch navigator. Essentially, when a route is active, the component is rendered. When a route is not active, the component is unmounted and the state is reset. And so that essentially just looks like this. It's not particularly fancy. Press go to 2, screen 1's unmounted. Press go to 1, screen 2's unmounted. There's no animation or anything between them, just pretty simple. And so the way that you would actually add this to your app is you would import this create switch navigator function and initialize it with a route config object. So the route configuration object has essentially keyed by the route name, and then the values are the screen components. The second parameter here is used to further configure the navigator. So first one, route configuration. The second one is configuration for the navigator itself. So this could be like the initial route name. There's a bunch of other stuff that you can use. It really depends on what navigator you're using. It's probably good to use initial route name because otherwise you're depending on the order of properties inside of an object, which is not recommended by this language spec. So when you actually want to use this navigator that you've now created, you have to render it. So you just drop it inside of some other React component and render it like that. So it's important to note as well that you should only explicitly render one navigator in your app, and other navigators should be nested as screen components. So they should be composed as routes within this other navigator. We'll see that more concretely later on. So when you want to navigate from one screen to another, you just call navigate on this navigation prop and pass in the route name. And the navigation prop is something that's passed into all screen components, and it has a kind of grab bag of useful functions for interacting with the navigation state. You can navigate to a specific screen like we just saw. You can go back, use parameters in various ways, check the focus state, et cetera. And these are the properties that are available in every navigator. We'll see later that you can also have navigation properties that are specific to a certain type of navigator. When we want to pass state between different screens, we just add this second argument to the navigate function, which is an object, and add whatever we want in there. Pretty straightforward. So here we're just adding a greeting with the word hello, which I understand translates to hello in Dutch. And then on this next screen, we're going to read the param by just saying navigation.getParam, and we grab the greeting, and then the second argument there is basically the fallback value. So if we get to the screen and we were not given a greeting param, then we use that. And so if we take that all and kind of throw it into a little app, just add a couple of borders around it, essentially we get this. And, I mean, this is like moderately useful, but you could really just implement this using setState. So I think the real more interesting stuff comes with some of the more complicated navigators and also when you start composing them. So first, let's look at one of the more interesting kinds of navigators, which is the stack navigator, which is potentially probably one of the most commonly used navigation patterns in any app, really. So what the stack navigator does is it displays one screen at a time, similar to in a switch navigator, but the inactive screens are maintained. Their state is maintained. They are not unmounted. And the screens, as they become visible, usually animate in some way on top of the now inactive screen. And it usually comes with some platform-specific UI, like headers, gestures so you can swipe to dismiss, and that sort of thing. So on iOS, it would look roughly like that. And as we dismiss different screens, it looks like that. And what really we have in our app under the covers is we have all of these screens still mounted, still in memory and with all of their state intact, and they're just sort of stacking on top of each other. The API for creating a stack navigator is identical, except you swap out the word switch with stack. And to navigate to a route, it's the same thing. This is one difference here is Switch Navigator doesn't actually maintain any sense of history, so you can't go back to other screens, but Stack does have history, and so you can call go back to another screen. Another way to go back is actually just to navigate to the screen by its name. And so if we're on screen 1 and we go to, well, actually, let's say we're on screen 2 and we go to 3. Now from screen 3, if we know that 2 is already mounted, we can actually just call navigate to route name 2, and that will dismiss the third screen and go back to the second. So go back is kind of like a generic way of saying, OK, go back. I don't care where we're going back to. Just bring me back to the previous thing. Whereas jumping between screens where you explicitly know where you want to go, that's where you'd use navigate. That's not always desirable, though. Sometimes you want to say, OK, I still want to navigate to 2, but I don't want to dismiss this screen. I just want to push this other screen on top, even though we might have another instance of it already in the stack. And in that case, you can use push explicitly. So push is an action that is added to the navigation prop within the stack. Navigate to a route, switch to it if it already exists. And push navigates to a route, but always by pushing it on top of the stack. So when we want to do things like configure different aspects of the navigator from within the screens, we can use this thing called navigation options. Here we're just changing the header title, but there are a bunch of other things that you can configure, and this really all depends on what navigator you're using. And you can even go and replace, in this case, the entire header with your own React component. So that looks roughly like this, the code that we have just written. So as you can see there, when I click add another 2, that's calling push, pushing the screen on top, and hit the back button, hit swipe back, and that sort of thing. And the UI for this looks like how it should on Android in that case, and here is just the iOS version of it. OK, so now that we've got some of the basics out of the way, let's talk about composing navigators. And this is, like I said, really, I think, where it starts to get interesting. So to recap, you can use navigators as screen components. Navigators themselves are React components. We'll see exactly what makes a React component sort of conform to the navigator interface shortly. A really interesting thing with composing navigators is you can continue to use navigate and all these other navigation actions as you would from a single navigator, and it's able to resolve what you are actually trying to do from the context across navigators, regardless of where you are in this hierarchy of navigators. So let's kind of put that into practice here. So here we have a stack navigator where we have a couple of screens in it. And then we have a switch navigator that contains the stack navigator on the main route. So what this kind of looks like is this, right? We have switch, has login, main. Login has a login screen. Main has a navigator, which has these other things inside of it. And what this lets us do is from the login screen, we can navigate to the home screen. And that will just work. It'll switch to that screen, even though that's not actually part of the home route is not a sibling of the login route. Similarly, from the home screen, we can navigate to the login screen, or we can navigate to a sibling route profile. And there's no difference in how you address these. So when we actually look at the result here, you can see we're navigating across these different navigators, and it just works. So how is this actually happening? What's going on to make this work? So when we start the app, our state kind of looks like this. We have this switch navigator. Our active route is login, and so that's kind of a little brighter here to indicate that. And you can see that the main route is currently not active. From the login screen, we call navigate home. What this actually does is it dispatches an action to the root of the entire navigator tree. So it's actually more equivalent to doing something like this. The navigator at the root says, OK, let's pass this action down to my active route and see if it's capable of handling this. The active route says, hey, I'm not a navigator. I don't know what to do with this thing. Yeah, not me. And so he says, the navigator then says, OK, well, let's see, maybe the inactive route, or if there were multiple ones, one of the inactive routes can handle this. So it goes and it asks main. Main says, yeah, I have a stack. Let's check this out. And it then says, OK, well, it looks like none of my routes are navigators, so I don't have to pass this down further. So let's see, maybe one of my routes has this name. Maybe I can handle this action. And in fact, it can. It does have a route named home, and it can handle the navigate action. So it returns some new state to indicate that this now exists, and this item is focused. It returns that state up. The switch sees that, OK, now you've updated your state. So I need to now update my state to switch to be focusing on the main route. And so now the switch updates its state, and the result of this now is a set state, which then causes a re-render of the navigators. And what you see is essentially switching between these different navigators. So it's kind of worth noting as well that if we were to add another route in the root switch navigator with the name home, so this would mean that we'd have one inside of the stack navigator and the switch. If we were to add that, it would actually behave the same way as before, because as we saw, we first try to handle the action on the deepest navigator before kind of bubbling that up the navigator tree and to the higher level navigators. All right, so extending navigators. So there are some cases where you might want to wrap a navigator with another React component to kind of do some logic when it's, for example, if it's mounted, or maybe you want to add some UI to it, or that kind of thing. And to do that, you need to expose this router static property on the component that wraps a navigator component. And you need to thread through this the navigation prop. If you don't do these, you're going to have some problems, and we'll look at what those problems will be. OK, so let's start off by looking at what would happen if we didn't expose the router static prop. So we're creating the switch navigator, and here we have a component that essentially just returns the switch navigator that we just initialized. And then at our root, we use that component that wraps that navigator. If we now try and use this app, we'll see that we're not, when we press sign in, it's still dispatching this navigate to home action, but nothing's happening. And the reason why that is essentially the root navigator tries to find another navigator that's capable of handling this action. So it says, hey, can any of my routes handle this? No, they cannot. The screen component, in this case, is not a navigator for either of these. And so it bubbles back up to the switch. And the switch says, well, yeah, I don't have any routes by this name, and so there's nothing I can do about it. And it just returns, and the state remains the same. So if we actually wanted to make this work, we would need to expose this router. And this is kind of the key of what makes a React component into a navigator, is that essentially it exposes this router property and threads through the navigation prop. And by exposing this router property, the navigation tree is able to see, OK, you're a navigator. Let's ask you to handle this action. So now we could do things like render any UI that we wanted around this. So if I wanted to add like a little tab bar to it, we could do that. And the result would look something like this. So So it's actually worth clarifying at this point. When I say that like the switch handles this action or the stack handles an action, what I really mean is that the router for these things handles the action. Let's look into the internals a little bit of a navigator to kind of understand why that is. So navigators tie together these two pieces. We talked about it in like one of the first slides that navigation involves some state and some UI. So navigators have some state that's particular to a certain navigation pattern, and it has a reducer, which is just called a router, that takes this action, takes its current state, so it says navigate home, and then returns the new state for the navigator. And the views are just the things that you see for how you interact with that state. So if we were to create our own version of this navigator, what we could do is import these various functions from React Navigation and then put together some placeholders here. So create my first navigator, that would be equivalent to the definition for the function create switch navigator. And then we're just going to create a placeholder navigation view. We initialize the router. Then we create the navigator, passing in the view, the router, and some configuration. The config is basically like the object that had the initial route name on it and all those other things. And then we just return create navigation container with this component. You can read the docs to learn a little bit more about the navigation container. Oh, OK. And that should hopefully clarify that for you. But essentially, it's like the state container for the app. So you can render it at any point without wrapping something in a provider. That actually might go away at some point, though. Anyways, so implementing the navigation view, we have my first navigation view. The first thing we need to do is grab the currently active route. Because what we want to do in this case is we want to render the component for the active route. The next thing is that we want to get the component from that route. And Create Navigator provides us with this useful prop called descriptors. Descriptors gives us all these various utilities for dealing with the route. So the navigation options is passed in through this options property on the descriptor. And we have various other things there as well that just make it easier to use. And then we can go ahead and actually render the component. And this, what we're seeing here is essentially the implementation of Switch Navigator. But if we wanted to add our tabs back, then we could map over the routes and render a button for each route in the tab. And then we just get the same thing as before. The difference here, of course, is that now you have this generic navigator that you can publish to NPM or whatever, and anyone can now use this inside of their app. And I think this is a really important and interesting aspect of React Navigation. So a big part of our recent 2.0 efforts have been to make React Navigation kind of deliver more on this promise of being like really customizable and really embracing the fact that most of it is written in JavaScript. And so we've kind of separated things really cleanly between what is a router, what is a navigation view, and in a way that you can basically take this navigation view, use it with any other navigation library. But if you want to tie it into React Navigation, you just basically add the code that I just showed on the previous slide for creating a navigator, as long as it conforms to this sort of basic API for what a navigation view needs. And we try to keep that API minimal so that it can hopefully be like a generic way of implementing these navigation-style components. And so what we see here are a couple navigators that have been published by other people. So this one's kind of neat with shared element transitions. Really, you can do anything because it's just all you're dealing with is a React component that has some state passed into it telling you what the different screens are. And you can manipulate that any way you like. As you saw with the stack navigator, that's just a thing that operates on this state and produces this thing that renders your components in an interesting way. Similar with the tab navigator there. So it's some pretty interesting stuff. And kind of the big picture here is hopefully that people will start to build these navigators more, and like we can't possibly hope as a few people working part of our time on React navigation to build something that will handle everybody's case. But if we make something that allows everybody to be able to easily customize any part of it to their liking, then hopefully that will be a kind of good way going forward for this library to support the various needs of the community. So if you want to learn some more, there's a lot of good links on here. I'll post these slides later on. I'm also going to do a talk at React Europe next month where I'll expand on some of the ideas from this one, with some more information on routers, for example. But yeah, I think that's it. So thanks a lot.